I left my fiancé at the altar, then watched his entire life crumble in real time, and then, 4 years ago, when I met Nathan at an investment conference in Boston, I thought I had found the person I would build my life with. We both worked in finance. We both had the same hunger for success, and we both understood the kind of lifestyle we wanted: elegant penthouses, weekend getaways in Europe, exclusive membership clubs, and a future that dripped in wealth and power. I wasn't naive. I had seen enough relationships fall apart over money, over ambition, over the inability to grow together. But with Nathan, I believed we were on the same page. Now, I look back at all the small details I brushed aside, all the warning signs that should have made me stop and think, all the tiny gut-wrenching moments that whispered, something isn't right here. But love, or at least the illusion of it, has a way of making you justify anything. I saw the cracks early on, but I convinced myself they weren't real fractures, just surface-level imperfections that every relationship had. The first and most glaring issue had a name, and that name was Isabel. Nathan's sister was 2 years older than him, unmarried, childless, and seemed to believe that his life was an extension of her own. From the very beginning, she treated me as an outsider, someone encroaching on territory she had long since claimed as hers. At first, I thought it was just the usual overprotective sibling dynamic. Some sisters were close to their brothers, and some families had strange, almost uncomfortable ways of showing affection. But Isabel took it to a whole different level. She clung to Nathan like a possessive girlfriend, draping herself over him at family gatherings, whispering things in his ear with a smirk, laughing just a little too long whenever she playfully grabbed his arm. Once, when I was sitting beside him at a restaurant during a family dinner, she physically wedged herself between us, muttering something about how she always had to sit next to her baby brother. She openly told me she didn't think Nathan should ever get married, that he wasn't husband material, and that he was meant to be free. I laughed it off at first, assuming she was joking or just testing my patience. But when Nathan proposed, I noticed a shift. Instead of backing off, she doubled down. She threw a tantrum when she found out I was moving in with him, saying things like, "Why does he need to live with you? He never needed to live with anyone before." She pouted when he missed one of their weekly dinner dates, making it sound as if I had stolen him from her. And when we started planning the wedding, she began inserting herself into every decision, arguing over the guest list, critiquing my choice of venue, making snide remarks about the dress I had chosen. The worst part? Nathan never really shut it down. When I told him it made me uncomfortable, he would chuckle, shake his head, and say I was being too sensitive. When I pointed out how strange it was that she reacted so dramatically to him canceling dinner with her one time, he shrugged and muttered, "That's just how Isabel is." Looking back, that should have been enough. That should have been the moment I walked away. But instead, I told myself I was overthinking, that family dynamics were complicated, that it was just an adjustment period. Then there was the money issue. Nathan had expensive taste, which I initially admired. He always looked impeccable, his suits tailored to perfection, his wrist adorned with designer watches, his cologne subtle yet powerful. He always booked first-class flights when we traveled, always knew the best restaurants with the most exclusive tables, always had access to clubs that weren't even on the radar for most people. I assumed he had the income to support it. We both worked in high-paying finance jobs, so it wasn't unrealistic to think he could afford the life he was living. But little things started to feel off. There was the time we were having dinner at a restaurant in Chicago, one of those places where they don't list prices on the menu because if you have to ask, you shouldn't be eating there. When the check came, Nathan handed over his card without hesitation, only to have the waiter return moments later, voice polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but your card has been declined." Nathan laughed, played it off as if it was just some ridiculous misunderstanding, muttered something about hitting his limit, and then pulled out a different card. I wanted to believe it was just an accident, but there was something about the way his smile tightened that made me uneasy. Then there was the vacation we planned together, a week in the Caribbean, something we had talked about for months. We agreed to split the cost, but at the last minute, Nathan asked me to put the whole trip on my card, promising he'd pay me back as soon as we got home. He never did. When I brought it up weeks later, he kissed me, smirked, and said, "Babe, I'll make it up to you." I even offered to help him organize his finances once, assuming maybe he was just bad with budgeting. He brushed it off with a laugh, dismissing it as not a big deal. It was just another thing I convinced myself to ignore. But the real truth? I had no idea where Nathan's money was actually coming from. I didn't learn the truth until 2 weeks before the wedding, when I attended a charity gala in San Francisco. It was one of those events filled with CEOs, hedge fund managers, and old money socialites who only pretended to care about philanthropy. I was sipping champagne, making polite conversation, when I met a man named Brandon. Brandon was older, early 40s, sharp-dressed, exuding that quiet, effortless wealth that didn't need to prove itself. We started talking, and at some point, I casually mentioned my upcoming wedding. He asked who I was marrying. I said Nathan's name. And then, everything changed. Brandon's entire demeanor shifted. His smile froze, his eyes flickered with something I couldn't place: recognition, amusement, maybe even a hint of pity. Then, with the kind of smooth detachment only someone truly wealthy could pull off, he pulled out his phone, scrolled for a few seconds, and then held the screen up for me to see. It was a photo of Nathan, lounging on a yacht, draped over Brandon's lap. I felt the blood drain from my face, my stomach twisting in ways I couldn't control. Brandon leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "He didn't tell you, did he?" I shook my head. Brandon sighed, swirled the whiskey in his glass, and muttered, "That's cute." And that was the moment everything shattered. I must have read the text on Brandon's phone at least 10 times, hoping that somehow I was misinterpreting what I was looking at. The image was crystal clear. Nathan, sprawled on the deck of a yacht, grinning like he didn't have a single worry in the world, his head tilted back against Brandon's chest. There was an intimacy in the way he was positioned, a familiarity that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. It wasn't just a casual photo between friends. There was no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't a business connection, and this definitely wasn't a one-time thing. My fiancé, the man I was about to marry in 2 weeks, had been living a life I knew absolutely nothing about. I forced myself to breathe, to maintain some semblance of composure, because the last thing I wanted was to create a scene in the middle of a room full of people who thrived on gossip. My mind raced through every possible explanation, every alternative scenario that might make sense. Maybe it was old, maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe there was some kind of logical, non-disastrous answer to what I was seeing. But deep down, I already knew. Brandon watched me carefully, clearly amused, but not unkind. He wasn't gloating, wasn't enjoying the moment in a cruel way. If anything, he looked slightly irritated, like someone who had been inconvenienced by a lie he hadn't realized he was part of. He leaned back against the bar, swirling his whiskey, and after a long pause, he finally asked the question that had been hanging between us like a knife waiting to drop. "So exactly how much did he tell you?" I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the delicate stem of my champagne flute. The words felt heavy on my tongue, bitter and unfamiliar, but I forced them out anyway. "Nothing," I admitted, my voice steadier than I expected. "I had no idea." Brandon sighed, shaking his head like he was already mentally kicking Nathan's ass. "Well, that's interesting," he murmured, taking another slow sip of his drink before meeting my gaze again. "Because Nathan made it sound like you knew. Actually, he made it sound like you were fine with it." I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to stay calm when all I wanted to do was throw my glass against the wall and start screaming. "He told you I knew?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the polite hum of conversation around us. Brandon nodded, expression unreadable. Not in so many words, but he definitely never acted like he was hiding anything. "We've been involved, I guess you could say, for about 3 years now." He let the words settle between us before adding, "And I've been paying for everything." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick, and my carefully constructed reality cracked down the center. 3 years. That meant this had been happening almost since the beginning. That meant Nathan had built our entire relationship on lies, letting me believe he was just another guy in finance who liked to live well, when in reality, He was being funded like some kind of high-end, bespoke-kept man. Every expensive dinner, every luxury vacation, every ridiculous purchase, it had never been his money. It had always been Brandon's. I felt sick. Brandon studied me like he was trying to gauge whether I was about to break down, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I forced myself to exhale slowly, gathering every ounce of dignity I had left, and looked him straight in the eye. And what exactly did he do to deserve all of that generosity? Brandon smirked at that, finally looking genuinely entertained. Now that, he said, tilting his glass slightly in my direction, is an excellent question. I don't know why, but I laughed. Maybe because it was so surreal that my brain had just decided to detach itself from reality. Maybe because the idea of Nathan pretending to be a high-powered financial genius while actually living off someone else's money was so ridiculous, it was almost impressive. Maybe because I had spent years ignoring every little sign, every moment that should have made me stop and think, and now, standing in front of a man who had literally been financing my fiancé's life, all I could do was find the whole thing absolutely fucking absurd. Brandon let out a slow, amused exhale, watching me carefully. So, he said, voice lower now, more measured. What do you want to do about it? For the first time that night, I really thought about it. I could confront Nathan, scream, demand explanations that would never be good enough. I could cause a scene, humiliate him, make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of man he was. But that wasn't enough. Not for something like this. I didn't just want to walk away. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to watch his world burn, the same way he had built it on lies and arrogance. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything in a single moment. So I smiled, took a slow sip of my champagne, and let the plan start to form in the back of my mind. I murmured, tilting my head slightly. I'd like to let him think he's won. Brandon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. I set my glass down on the bar, exhaling as if I were making a simple business decision. He doesn't know I know. He still thinks everything is perfect. So I say we let him keep thinking that. I met Brandon's gaze, eyes steady, voice calm despite the adrenaline rushing through me. Let him have his bachelor party. Let him send his sweet little texts about how much he loves me. Let him believe he's 2 weeks away from locking down the perfect life. Brandon's smirk widened, slow and appreciative. And then, I smiled back, sharper this time, all the softness gone. Then, I leave him at the altar. But not before I make sure he loses absolutely everything. Brandon let out a low chuckle, lifting his glass in an almost mocking toast. Now that, he murmured, is a plan I can get behind. For the next 2 weeks, I played my role flawlessly. I let Nathan think I was blissfully unaware, that I was still the devoted fiancé, planning the perfect wedding. I posed for engagement photos, let him kiss me in front of friends and family, acted like nothing in the world was wrong. I smiled when he told me he couldn't wait to spend forever with me, when he held my hand and whispered about how lucky he was to have me. And the whole time, I was making sure that when I walked away, he wouldn't just lose me. He would lose everything. The morning of the wedding arrived, and the air was thick with the kind of artificial excitement that only comes from a room full of people pretending everything is perfect. My bridal suite was a flurry of movement, stylists adjusting my veil, bridesmaids sipping champagne, my mother fussing over last-minute details as if any of it truly mattered. The dress, a custom couture gown that had taken months to design, hung elegantly against my body, a symbol of everything this day was supposed to represent. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have actually felt something. Instead, I just felt the sharp, quiet satisfaction of knowing that by the time the sun set, Nathan's entire world would be in ruins. I had barely touched my glass of champagne, unwilling to dull the clarity that surged through me. Every movement I made felt deliberate, every word I spoke carefully measured, because I wasn't just playing the role of a bride. I was playing the role of a woman deeply in love, hopelessly devoted, blindly walking toward her future. In reality, I was counting down the minutes until I could finally tear it all apart. The knock on the door came exactly 10 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. I knew, before anyone even moved to answer it, exactly who it would be. Isabel never could resist inserting herself into moments that didn't belong to her, as if her presence was more important than whatever was actually happening. When she stepped into the room, her expression was the same as always, smug, self-satisfied. That particular brand of entitlement that only someone who has never been told no in their life could wear so effortlessly. She walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, taking in the sight of me in my wedding gown like she was assessing whether I deserved to be wearing it. She didn't congratulate me, didn't offer any words of encouragement, because that was never what this was about. Instead, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper, her lips curling into something that was almost a smirk. "You'll never be the woman he loves most," she murmured, her tone dripping with victory. "I'll always come first." I felt the words settle against my skin, but unlike every other time she had tried to push me down, this time, they didn't land the way she wanted them to. She thought she was winning, thought she was planting a seed of doubt in my mind, thought I was still the same woman who had spent years trying to rationalize her existence in Nathan's life. She thought I was still foolish enough to believe that I had ever been his priority. But she had no idea that I was already gone. Before I could even respond, the second betrayal of the morning arrived, stepping into the suite as if he owned the entire moment. Nathan entered with the kind of confidence that only a man who has never faced real consequences can have. His tuxedo perfectly tailored, his expression relaxed, as if he wasn't about to enter a marriage built entirely on deception. He barely glanced at me before turning toward Isabel, laughing softly, as if the weight of her words was something he found amusing rather than disturbing. "She's right, you know," he said, his voice carrying a casual certainty, like it was just a simple fact rather than the cruelest thing he could possibly say to a woman about to marry him. That was it. That was the moment. Everything in me stilled, not with shock or hurt, but with the kind of final clarity that only comes when you realize you are completely, utterly done. The illusion shattered so completely that I almost wanted to laugh, because I had spent years trying to be the woman Nathan needed, only to realize he had never needed me at all. He had needed an image, a cover, a convenient placeholder while he lived the life he actually wanted. And now, he thought he had won. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the bouquet in my hands, letting my fingers tighten around the delicate stems for a single beat longer. Then, I smiled, calm and measured, and extended the bouquet toward Isabel. "Enjoy the wedding," I whispered, voice so soft that for a moment, Nathan didn't even react. Then, before either of them could process what was happening, I turned away, lifting my gown slightly as I walked toward the door, my steps smooth, unwavering. The gasps behind me barely registered, the stunned murmurs from my bridesmaids, the sound of my mother's voice breaking through the confusion. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the hallway stretching in front of me, the exit that led away from the life I had been seconds from locking myself into. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I walked out of the bridal suite, down the empty corridor, through the grand entrance of the hotel, and stepped into the black limo waiting at the curb. The door shut with a satisfying click, sealing me away from the chaos I had just left behind. The air conditioning blasted against my skin, a sharp contrast to the heavy summer heat outside, but the real relief came from the man sitting across from me. Brandon was already pouring a drink, his expression unreadable as he swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching me with mild amusement. "That bad, huh?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still surging through my veins, but there was no hesitation in my answer. "Worse." Brandon smirked and gestured toward the champagne chilling in the ice bucket between us. "Drink." I didn't even pause before reaching for the bottle, popping the cork with a force that sent foam spilling over the rim. I poured myself a full glass, my hand steady now, my pulse finally beginning to slow. I had just walked out of my own wedding, but it wasn't over yet. Brandon took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving mine. "So, what's the next move?" That was the thing. I wasn't done yet. Walking away was just the first part. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted to make sure Nathan never forgot what he lost. I wanted him to feel the weight of his mistakes, to understand that he wasn't just losing me, but the entire facade he had built for himself. I wanted him to hurt the way he had let me hurt. I leaned forward, gripping the delicate stem of my glass between my fingers, my voice calm but firm. How fast can you ruin his life? Brandon's grin widened, slow and dangerous, as he pulled out his phone. Let's find out. Back inside the hotel, chaos was already beginning to unfold. At first, nobody had noticed I was gone. Guests were still chatting, sipping champagne, waiting for the ceremony to start. The pianist continued playing soft classical music, unaware that there would be no bride walking down the aisle. But then, the whispers started. Where's the bride? Is there a delay? Why is Isabel holding the bouquet? Nathan was still standing near the altar, laughing with his groomsmen, pretending he wasn't starting to feel a cold sense of unease creeping into his chest. He didn't notice the hotel staff approaching him until one of them cleared his throat, voice polite but firm. Sir, the man said carefully, we need to discuss an urgent issue with the billing. Nathan frowned, irritation flickering across his face. Billing. The staff member hesitated before responding. Yes, sir. The charges on the main card have been declined repeatedly. At first, Nathan laughed, assuming it was a mistake. But then, his expression changed. Because Brandon had already made the call. Nathan stood at the altar, frozen, his mind struggling to process the reality unraveling in front of him. The guests were shifting in their seats, murmuring in confusion as the officiant glanced around awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to continue waiting or start making excuses. Isabel was still clutching my bouquet, her fingers tightening around the delicate flowers as her face turned an alarming shade of red. But the real chaos wasn't happening in the rows of confused wedding guests. It was happening in the whispers moving through the staff, the frantic looks exchanged between the wedding planner and the hotel manager, the sudden realization that everything was beginning to crumble beneath Nathan's feet. The hotel's head of finance had pulled Nathan aside, away from the murmuring crowd, away from the judging stares, away from the disaster he hadn't yet begun to comprehend. He barely registered the words at first, the polite but firm insistence that there was a billing issue that needed to be resolved immediately. The main card he had provided had been declined not once, not twice, but repeatedly, and now, the vendors were beginning to pull out. The caterers had already refused to serve another plate. The bartenders were no longer pouring drinks. The DJ, who had been prepared to play the grand processional, was standing near his equipment, arms crossed, waiting for further instruction. And worst of all, the hotel itself was demanding immediate payment, or else the entire event would be forcibly shut down. Nathan laughed, but it was forced, brittle, the kind of laugh that a man gives when he still believes he's in control of a situation that is slipping away too quickly for him to catch. That's ridiculous, he muttered, shaking his head as he pulled out his phone. Let me just. His fingers moved over the screen, attempting to transfer funds, to switch cards, to prove that this was nothing more than an administrative mistake. But the moment he opened his banking app, his stomach dropped. The accounts were frozen. Every single one. The numbers were still there, the balances still listed, but the funds were inaccessible, locked in place by something far beyond his understanding. He tried another card, then another. Each one met with the same automated denial. The reality of the situation began to settle in, slow and suffocating. Somewhere across the city, inside a quiet limo with air conditioning humming softly in the background, Brandon leaned back against the leather seat, his fingers moving swiftly across his phone screen. I watched him with quiet satisfaction, my own glass of champagne untouched on the table beside me, my heart no longer racing, my breath slow and steady. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment where everything Nathan had built for himself, every carefully constructed lie, every layer of deception, came crashing down in real time. All right, Brandon muttered, half to himself, half to me. The plaza is shutting everything down. Bartenders aren't serving, DJs packing up, catering is done. Should be fun to watch. I turned my gaze toward the tinted window, imagining the exact scene playing out back at the venue. The sheer panic that must be unfolding, the desperate explanations, the scrambling for control that would never return. The wedding had been designed to be an event of extravagance, a spectacle of wealth and prestige, but now it was collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. I exhaled slowly, tilting my head slightly as I studied Brandon, my voice even, measured, calm. Not enough. Brandon's eyes flicked up to meet mine, the amusement in them sharp and intrigued. "You're ruthless," he murmured, shaking his head with something almost like admiration. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "You're just figuring that out?" He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he unlocked his phone again. "All right, what else?" I leaned forward, my elbows resting lightly on my knees, my fingers still curled around the stem of my glass. "You said he used your money for everything, right?" Brandon nodded, raising an eyebrow. "The apartment, the car, the memberships, all of it." I tapped my nails against the side of my glass, letting the weight of my next words settle between us. "Take it back." Brandon grinned, slow and dangerous, his fingers already moving across his screen. Within minutes, the calls had been made. The luxurious apartment Nathan had pretended to own was no longer his. The lease had been revoked, his access denied, the locks already scheduled to be changed. The Porsche he had been so proud to drive was already on its way to being towed, repossessed under Brandon's name. The credit cards he had so carelessly swiped were now frozen, his financial safety nets pulled out from beneath him. And just as the weight of those losses began to sink in, his phone buzzed one final time. A message from a number he didn't recognize. "Damon wants to see you." Nathan's hands went clammy. His breath caught in his throat. His entire body stiffened as he stared at the screen, the words burning into his mind, a warning far more terrifying than anything that had happened so far. Because this wasn't Brandon. This wasn't an annoyed ex-benefactor cutting him off from his luxuries. This was something else. This was a mistake he had made that he couldn't fix. This was a debt that couldn't be reasoned with. Across from me, Brandon's phone rang, the name flashing across the screen in bold, unmistakable letters. "Damon." Brandon exhaled, muttering a low curse under his breath before answering. He pressed the speaker button without hesitation, the quiet hum of the car's interior making the voice on the other end even sharper, even more unforgiving. "I hear you've been playing games with my money." Damon's voice was smooth, calm, almost too polite, but there was something else beneath it, something cold and final. Brandon's jaw tightened, but his response was just as controlled. "This isn't about me." A pause. "Then who's it about?" Brandon leaned back slightly, his gaze flicking toward me before settling back on the phone. "Nathan." A low chuckle. "The little rat." I had a feeling. Brandon tilted his head slightly, watching me for a reaction I didn't give. "What exactly did he do?" Damon let out a slow breath, the sound of ice clinking against glass in the background. "Let's just say he convinced me to invest in something that doesn't exist. A fake deal. A shell company. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into nothing. And now he thinks he can walk away." My stomach twisted slightly, but I kept my expression blank, my fingers tightening around the base of my glass. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't just about making Nathan suffer. This was something much bigger. Brandon ran a hand over his face, sighing through his nose. "How much are we talking?" A pause. Then Damon's voice, slow and deliberate. $3 million. I felt my heart skip a beat. Nathan had scammed a man like Damon Russo out of $3 million, and somehow, he had been arrogant enough to think there wouldn't be consequences. He had been careless enough to believe that he could get away with it. He had been foolish enough to think that the people he was stealing from wouldn't come collecting. Brandon turned toward me, his expression unreadable. I met his gaze, voice steady despite the cold dread creeping up my spine. "We need to find him before they do." The moment Brandon ended the call, the weight of what we had just set into motion settled into my chest. I had spent weeks meticulously planning Nathan's downfall, orchestrating every moment so that when I walked away, he wouldn't just lose me. He would lose everything he had built his life around. But this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't just about financial ruin or public humiliation anymore. This was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. I had wanted him to suffer, wanted him to feel the depth of his betrayal in every possible way. But I had never intended for his mistakes to cost him his life. Brandon rubbed his jaw, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his fingers tapping absently against the leather interior of the car. "You know," he muttered after a moment, voice low, contemplative. "I assumed he was an idiot, but I didn't think he was this reckless." I exhaled slowly, staring down at my phone, still open to the last text message Nathan had sent me. He had been calling for the past hour, his desperation growing with each unanswered attempt. I had let them ring out, had watched each new voicemail notification pile up on my screen, knowing that whatever pathetic excuse he had planned would be meaningless to me now. But with Damon involved, with $3 million unaccounted for and a man like Nathan running out of places to hide, there was no way to predict how this would end. Brandon glanced at me, brow raised slightly. "You're thinking about picking up, aren't you?" I tilted my head slightly, watching as another call from Nathan lit up the screen. "I just need to know where he is." Brandon exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he gestured toward the phone. "Put it on speaker." I let the call ring for another 2 beats before finally answering. The second I did, Nathan's voice came through, breathless and frantic, the calm arrogance he had always carried completely shattered. "Where the hell are you?" I tilted my head back against the seat, letting the silence stretch between us before answering. "Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing." Nathan exhaled sharply, the sound ragged, his breath uneven like he had been running. "You need to listen to me. You don't understand what's happening." Brandon scoffed quietly from across the car, shaking his head in amusement. "I think we understand just fine, Nate." The silence on the other end was instant, thick with barely contained panic. Nathan swallowed hard, his voice lowering, more desperate now. "Brandon, Manitoba, look, I can fix this. I just need time. You still have money, right? You can cover this, and I'll." Brandon barked out a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Oh, now you want my help? What happened to all that confidence? What happened to Brandon won't care?" Nathan hesitated, but when he finally spoke again, his voice was smaller, stripped of all the bravado and control he had once held over every situation. "I messed up." Brandon clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his phone as he leaned forward slightly. "Yeah, you did. And Damon isn't exactly the forgiving type." Nathan's breath hitched slightly, the panic cracking through the surface again. "Please, just tell me what to do." I let out a slow breath, tapping my nails against the side of my glass. "Where are you?" Silence. Then, finally, a whisper. "The apartment." I glanced at Brandon, arching an eyebrow. "The one you just revoked his lease on?" Brandon smirked, shaking his head. "Wow, he really is a dumbass." I turned back to the phone, my voice colder now, sharper. "Stay there. We're coming." The drive was quiet, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. By the time we arrived, the doorman didn't even hesitate when he saw Brandon, barely lifting an eyebrow as he accepted a crisp $100 bill in exchange for letting us through. The elevator ride was slow, the tension thick, every floor we passed bringing us closer to the man who had spent years lying to me, manipulating me, treating me like nothing more than a convenient cover for his secret life. When the doors finally slid open, the hallway was eerily silent. And then, there he was. Nathan was sitting on the floor outside the apartment, his knees pulled up, his head in his hands, the pristine tuxedo he had worn to the wedding now wrinkled and disheveled. When he looked up and saw us, something in his face shifted, not relief, not anger, just pure, unfiltered defeat. Brandon crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Wow, look at you. You look terrible." Nathan exhaled shakily, his hands clenching into fists before he forced himself to stand. His eyes flickered between the two of us before finally settling on me. "Did you ever love me?" I didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't let the question settle in the way he wanted it to. "Did you?" Nathan's jaw tightened, his hands still curled into fists at his sides. "Of course I did." I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "So when you were flying to Spain with Brandon or scamming Damon Russo out of $3 million, was that love?" His face paled, his entire body stiffening at the mention of Damon's name. I was going to fix everything. I was going to make things right after the wedding. I let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking my head. You weren't going to fix anything. You were going to keep lying until you couldn't anymore. Nathan exhaled, shoulders sagging, his voice quieter now. I didn't want you to know. I held his gaze, my voice steady. No, you didn't want me to leave. He swallowed hard, glancing toward Brandon, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. What do I do? Brandon sighed, shaking his head. That's not our problem anymore. Nathan flinched, his lips parting slightly, as if he was about to argue, about to plead, about to try one last time to talk his way out of the consequences he had built for himself. But I didn't let him. I turned toward the elevator, my fingers trailing lightly over the buttons before pressing the one that would take us back down, away from him, away from this, away from everything. Nathan tried calling again that night, but I blocked the number before I even let it ring. Isabel sent a 3-page email blaming me for ruining her brother's life, telling me that I had destroyed him, that I had been the problem all along. I responded with a single sentence before blocking her too. Enjoy being the most important woman in his life. Nathan disappeared after that. Whether he ran or whether Damon found him first, I never asked. Some people fall from grace, some people are pushed, and some people dig their own graves without ever realizing it. Brandon and I kept in touch after that, though not in the way people might assume. We became business partners, allies in a strange way, connected by a disaster neither of us had seen coming. And me? I walked away free. No wedding, no fraud, no Nathan. Just me, a glass of champagne, and the rest of my life waiting. And honestly, I've never felt lighter.